Welcome back to the Al-Monitor Brief. I'm Adam Lucente. The Kurdish-led Syrian Democratic Forces and the Syrian military both accused each other on Wednesday of violating the ceasefire they reached a day earlier, highlighting the precarious nature of the truce in the northeast. Now, this past week in Syria has been one of profound change. The transitional government's forces began an offensive against the SDF earlier this month, seizing large swaths of territory. The SDF is now confined to the area around Kobane, a city east of the Euphrates River close to Turkey, and the far northeast of the country. So why is all this happening? Let's rewind. The SDF formed in 2015. It is led by the People's Protection Units, known as the YPG, and they are notably considered by Turkey to be an offshoot of the outlawed Turkish Kurdish militant group, the Kurdistan Workers' Party, aka PKK. Now, the YPG and the SDF proved very effective at fighting ISIS, and they got US support as a result. The Autonomous Administration of North and East Syria was created and led by the SDF in the northeast, and that expanded beyond Kurdish-majority areas to areas where Arabs predominate, like Deir ez-Zor and Raqqa, the former ISIS capital. Syrian President Bashar al-Assad was overthrown in late 2024 in a rebel offensive, and Ahmed al-Shara, who led the jihadist group Hayat Tahrir al-Sham during the war, set up a new transitional government. Now, Shara quickly said that he wanted a centralized Syrian state. He kept the name Syrian Arab Republic, despite some criticism, but he also conducted outreach to Kurds and other minority groups. In March of 2025, Shara and SDF leader Mazloum Kobani signed an agreement to integrate the SDF into the new Syrian army by the end of the year. But that didn't happen, largely because they disagreed on whether the SDF would retain any autonomy in such an arrangement. In late 25, clashes broke out in parts of Aleppo, where SDF-affiliated fighters have had a presence since the civil war. Those fighters were recently expelled in a deal. The government then moved on to other SDF areas, taking Raqqa, Deir ez-Zor, among other places. The government has also taken control of ISIS detention facilities like El Hol and Shadadi that were previously guarded by the SDF. And Syrian authorities actually say that some ISIS detainees have escaped amid the chaos. Back to the present, the latest ceasefire came on Tuesday. And there are mixed signals in this deal. The text, according to Syrian government releases, says that the SDF must integrate, but says discussions on that will continue. It says the Syrian army won't enter Kurdish areas, and it says the SDF will get senior positions in the government. Late last week, Shara actually issued a decree declaring Kurdish a national language and restoring citizenship of Syrian Kurds. It's worth noting here that many Kurds were rendered stateless under Assad. US President Donald Trump and Shara spoke on the phone on Monday, and the American leader said that Syria should hold off on entering Hasaka, which is currently held by the SDF and the site of one of the ISIS facilities. On Tuesday, U.S. envoy to Syria, Tom Barrack, offered a glimpse into the administration's thinking, saying on X that the original purpose of the SDF as an anti-ISIS force has, quote, largely expired now that there is a government in Damascus willing to fight ISIS. Syria notably agreed to join the U.S.-led anti-ISIS coalition last November. So what now? I spoke to Al-Monitor's chief correspondent, Amberin Zaman, to make sense of all this. Amberin has extensive knowledge of and sources in northeast Syria, having reported from there for years. She explains what the Trump administration policy is now towards the SDF, whether Kurdish autonomy will continue to a degree or disappear altogether, and whether this latest ceasefire will hold. Hope you enjoy. Amberin, welcome back to the Al-Monitor Brief.
Thanks for having me, Adam.
Amberin, as you know, this is a evolving situation, but I want to get your latest. I mean, what is the situation on the ground currently in northeast Syria? What do we know, and what are the prospects for this latest ceasefire holding, in your view?
Well, it's very hard to get any kind of accurate information because there's an information war going on, propaganda being spouted by both sides, a lot of finger pointing, and very hard to verify some of the claims, including ones that suggest government forces have been carrying out beheadings, that sort of thing. One of the most alarming claims, and that have been substantiated in part, is that we have prison breakouts at the ISIS detention facilities, and the Syrian government has confirmed that over 100 detainees had escaped from one particular prison, and that they'd managed to capture some 81 of them, recapture them. But, the idea that even one ISIS prisoner is out on the loose, of course, is terrifying. And what's been very frustrating for me as a reporter is the fact that we've had absolutely no information provided to us by CENTCOM, Central Command, which is leading the anti-ISIS operations inside Syria. They have provided no clarification on what the status of those ISIS prisoners are exactly. And I contacted the Syria envoy's office this morning, and they had no comment to provide on that situation. And we have seen some very alarming reports detailing breakouts from numerous prisons across the Kurdish-run territory and beyond. But as to the ceasefire that was announced yesterday, the latest ceasefire, and the Kurds were given 4 days to sort of come up with a plan for its full implementation, the terms contained within it. I would say that it's largely holding. We do have reports of sporadic clashes, particularly in Raqqa. We hear of government forces advancing towards the town of Kobani on the Turkish border, which, of course, is a very symbolic place because that's where the US Kurdish partnership began when it fell under siege from ISIS in 2014, and the United States intervened. But as you know, and as we reported first, President Donald Trump called President Shara on Monday and told him to keep Syrian government forces out of the Kurdish areas, and notably outside the city of Al-Hasaka, where you have two major ISIS detention facilities. One of the big problems that's emerged is what we're witnessing is that a lot of this chaos that allows these prisoners to flee stems from the fact of a very disorderly handover, and in certain circumstances, you have the SDF saying it's forced to just abandon those positions around the prisons, abandon, basically protecting them because they feel that they're, facing great risk from the local population who might attack them and join forces with the prisoners inside. So it's a very critical situation. I would say that that is the immediate focus priority for everyone right now. Yeah.
And what is, as far as you know, what is the plan for these prisons? Is it that the Syrian government will take control of all of them, or does the one in Hasaka remain under SDF rule? I mean, what do we know about that?
That's an excellent question, Adam, and we don't know for the moment what will happen with Al-Hasaka, which is not, can't be defined as a purely Kurdish area because it has a mixed population, and that's why it's contested. You have a significant Arab population there, Christians, and some Kurds. It's hard to say who's in the majority. And already we know that Syrian government forces have taken over the prison in Shadadi. They've taken over the Al-Hol camp, which is, where the ISIS families reside. It's the biggest camp for the families, and a very dangerous place. And we'll have to see going forward what kind of a job Syrian government forces do protecting those facilities, keeping them under control. But of course, your question pertains to the other prisons that are inside the Kurdish area, namely in Kamishla, for example, in Derek. These are areas where you have many more Kurds, and that's where, in fact, a lot of the Kurdish forces have now withdrawn to from the Arab areas that were taken over during the weekend by the Syrian government forces. What will happen there, of course, is very important. Will US forces stay in that area is another very critical question. And my feeling is that for as long as those prisons, the future of those prisons and how they will be run is not fully determined, they absolutely will. To make sure that nothing goes wrong and that you don't have another sort of group of large groups of ISIS prisoners fleeing again, and also because I think it's well understood, including by the Syrian government itself, that there's a lot of distrust felt by the local population there towards the Syrian government forces based on what happened last year in the coastal areas with the massacres of the Alawites and then by the Druze. I would say that the perhaps other big risk, in addition to what how the ISIS prison situation unfolds, is what the tribes will do, the Arab tribes. Because there's a lot of, vengeance killing that we hear reports of, a lot of hard feelings that have accumulated over the years, however much, the official narrative was that the Arabs were very happy to live under SDF control. Well, that was certainly true under Assad's rule because, it was a much more stable, safer place. And now, though, the situation has changed since a like-minded Sunni Arab has now taken over and is supported so strongly by the international community and above all by President Donald Trump. So how they figure out future governance, both civilian and security-wise, these are the things that I'm pretty sure are being now very hotly debated among the Kurds themselves and how much of this plan that the Syrians offered them they're willing to accept or not. We will find out in the coming days.
We'll get back to the plan, but I first wanted to ask you about, you mentioned this call between Trump and Shara. There are also statements from U.S. Envoy Barak. What do these statements indicate on the U.S. position towards Syria at present?
Well, I would say that Barak's uh, post on X yesterday laid bare what the US policy on Syria currently is, and certainly on the Kurds is, and has been for some time. And it should come as no surprise because back in 2017, as you recall, a senior US official, Jonathan Cohen, who was Deputy Assistant Secretary for the bureau that's in charge of Turkey, among other countries, said in public this relation is a transactional, temporary, and tactical one. And the US always refrained from engaging politically with the SDF because A, they're not into the business of nation building anymore since the Iraq War, and B, because they did not want to further antagonize a key NATO ally, Turkey, already very, very deeply upset about the relationship in the first place. And the reason for that is that many of the leaders of the SDF were previously active inside the PKK, the Kurdish group that has been fighting Turkey since 1984, and that last year declared that it was disbanding and disarming in line with peace process that's going on in Turkey at this time, negotiations between the PKK's imprisoned leader Abdullah Öcalan and the Turkish government for an end to the conflict and some kind of resolution of the Kurdish question there. But that whole thing, a process, got stuck on what was happening in Syria because in Ankara's mind, part of fixing the problem is not just the PKK dissolving itself, but the SDF as well, because in Ankara's mind, the SDF is an extension, if not part and parcel, of the PKK. And so what you saw in Ambassador Barak's tweet yesterday was a very clear message that they're done with the SDF, that the SDF's utility has now outlived its purpose, which was to fight ISIS, because now there's a government in Damascus that the United States is doing business with that joined the anti-ISIS coalition back in September last year. And it's very clear that going forward, the United States will be working with the Syrian army to continue the work it was doing with the SDF. And in an ideal world, obviously, if the sides were able to reconcile, it would be to the benefit of all if they could, work together with these SDF people who have been involved in this fight for so long, have been so successful, and have so much to bring to the table. That would be the ideal scenario. But of course, the chain of command is where things get contested because the Syrian government says, well, do remember that we're now in charge and you will be subordinated to us. And of course, the US government seems to espouse that view as well. They like to deal with governments rather than non-state actors now that they have the opportunity to do so in Syria with Assad's fall.
And in terms of this latest ceasefire on Tuesday, as you mentioned in your report, it's not that different from one a few days ago. What points in this agreement do you think would be the main sticking points between Damascus and the Syrian Kurdish authorities?
Look, Adam, that's an excellent question. And of course, overall, it's a pretty bad deal for the Kurds, given that they were very much hoping to keep their autonomous administration intact, to retain control over the Arab majority areas where most of Syria's oil is in order to extract a, a deal for themselves and other minorities in Syria that would be constitutionally guaranteed and ensure decentralized rule, which they believe is the best way of running the country. And of course, the central government disagrees, and there's nothing in those articles that suggests in any form or any way that they will be able to preserve their current autonomous structure, either in security terms or administrative terms. But having said that, there are, you know, there is there are references, for example, to Kurdish areas, which is, very forward-leaning if you think about it in a more historical context, because in Syria, prior to the civil war, the Kurds were denied, any kind of status, let alone status. They weren't even given identity papers. They couldn't start their own businesses, buy property, go to university for a long time. That kind of softened under Assad Jr. And so now you have a government that actually refers to Kurds by name, that recently decreed that the Kurdish language could be taught in schools, both public and private. In this latest ceasefire agreement, they talk about special Kurdish areas and offering them some kind of protection and articulating that Syrian government forces, at least for now, will not be entering Kurdish villages or the city centers of Hasaka, of Kamishli. These are quite significant. And, the glass isn't, empty, it's half full. Or half full is an exaggeration, but there is some wine in that glass. And we also saw that having initially insisted that the SDF join the Syrian National Army as individuals, in other words, be totally collapsed. The language is sufficiently vague that you could envisage a return to the idea that was on the table very recently of the Kurds maybe preserving, let's say, a brigade or something along those lines. And certainly, I believe, especially in Kobani, that's been singled out, a local police force that would be lightly armed to protect the local citizens. Going forward, I think, these details can be worked out. There can be some kind of a workable model going forward, nothing close to what the Kurds imagine they might have. But given the fact that the circumstances, as Ambassador Barak noted, have changed so drastically, particularly after October 7, with Israel pushing back full force against Iran, Iran losing its foothold in Syria, Hezbollah being so badly weakened, and the Iranian-backed Shia militias in Iraq, I think, are very, very nervous about what awaits them. And the Russians, very weakened, have changed the balance of power in Syria and to the Kurds' disadvantage, I would say. So they have far fewer cards to play with, and especially after the Americans have now so openly said, this is it, guys. And of course, going forward, it wouldn't be unexpected that American forces might pull out of the Northeast altogether and either redeploy to, say, places like Tan. Well, they're already in Tan, but rather Deir ez-Zor, where they have a base that they'd evacuated, and to Damascus. I mean, all of these things could happen. So they will have to make the best of what's not a great hand. And if they're pragmatic, I'm sure they'll come to terms with this new reality. That's the hope all around.
I guess what I'm wondering is beyond this agreement, and we can conclude with this, like, do you see any future for any sort of Kurdish self-rule in Syria? Or is this like the beginning of the end of the autonomous administration? I mean, what do people there think, or what are the prospects that, some sort of entity might stay, might linger on?
Well, the Kurdish people never give up. They're very tenacious. We see that in Turkey, we see that in Iraq, we see that in Iran, and certainly in Syria. And so to expect these people to give up would be a very, I think, a very bad misreading of the future. They're not going to. It's just the methods that they embrace that we need to understand, and whether they opt for a political struggle or armed struggle. And I think to be realistic at this point, one would opt for the former rather than the latter, because the circumstances don't lend themselves to any kind of gains that could be achieved through violence. And of course, you have Turkey sitting there on the border, who has gone into North Syria to, militarily, repeatedly, to push back against what they think is Kurdish separatism, even though the Kurds there say they don't want a separate state, and they could easily intervene again. And of course, the topography of northeast Syria is nothing like the mountain terrain that you have in Iraq or Iran, where it's harder really to fight against guerrillas, even though even there, Turkish drone technology, of course, has proved very lethal. And so I think going forward, of course, you would hope that any kind of sort of peaceful conclusion of this current crisis that allows for peaceful cohabitation between the Kurds and Damascus, where the exact nature of their administrative relationship is figured out, and that can't be done in, 4 days. And if that goes in the right direction, and Turkey also is convinced that that region and its administration no longer poses a threat, you will see borders opening, trade resuming, and hopefully economic benefits deriving from the new status quo that can offer everyone a brighter future, and create a situation where the United States, Turkey, a critical ally, and Damascus and the Kurds are kind of on the same page going forward.
Amberin, thanks so much for your time and your insights, and we look forward to more of your reporting on these topics.
Thank you, and I look forward to your reporting, Adam. Keep up the great work. Thank you.
Likewise, thank you. Don't go anywhere. We'll be back with more after this short break.
Today's transformation of the Middle East is at the center of global geopolitics. Whether you're an analyst, diplomat, executive, or academic, you need the best reporting and analysis to understand what's really happening on the ground and what it means for the world. Al Monitor is the award-winning independent leader in Middle East news. From Riyadh to Beirut, Abu Dhabi to Doha, and Baghdad to Tehran, our team of over 100 expert journalists report daily on the top stories driving the regional trends. Download our mobile app and subscribe to Al Monitor to follow what leaders and decision makers are reading every day. Go to almonitor.com, that's AL-MONITOR.com, and use promo code POD25, POD25 for a discount.
Okay, we're back. I want to conclude with a bit on neighboring Iraq. I've been to northeast Syria, including SDF lines and the Al Hol camp a few times, but I spent most of my time in the Middle East in the Kurdistan region of Iraq. And Iraq is very concerned about what's happening next door in Syria. Iraqi Prime Minister Mohammed Shia al-Sudani held calls with Kobani and Shara on Tuesday. The Iraqi readout from the call with Shara mentioned border protection and ISIS remnants among the points of discussion. The same day, the leader of the Kurdistan Democratic Party, Masoud Barzani, spoke with Shara on the phone. And that's actually the second call between the two of them this month. The Kurdistan Democratic Party, or KDP, is of course the dominant party in the Kurdistan Regional Government of Iraq. And on Wednesday, Sudani visited the Iraq-Syria border. Now, one of Iraq's borders is controlled by the SDF, another by the Syrian government. Iraq wants these to remain stable and doesn't want ISIS fighters on the loose. Iraq has repatriated a lot of Iraqis affiliated with ISIS in recent years from camps in Syria, and Iraqi forces continue anti-ISIS operations with the US troops that remain in the country. Neither the federal government in Baghdad nor the Kurdistan regional government want an ISIS resurgence because ISIS, as you remember, destabilized Iraq for years. Iraq has treaded carefully with the new Syrian government. They aren't natural allies, Shara coming from a Sunni jihadist background who actually fought with al-Qaeda in Iraq after the US invasion, and the Iraqi government being led by Shiite Muslims, many of whom are close to Iran. But the two countries have been working on security together, including the war on drugs. The KRG started out optimistic towards the new Syrian government, but they were critical during the Aleppo clashes. And the KRG historically has not had good ties with the SDF, but those have been warming in recent years. Iraq is currently in the midst of choosing a new prime minister, watching what happens in neighboring Iran with the protests there, and plans are stalled to better integrate the Iran-backed militias in the country into the Iraqi security apparatus, though US pressure on that point remains. Whether ISIS can regroup in Iraq amid the chaos in Syria is something that is worth watching. Thanks for listening to the Al Monitor Brief. Be sure to follow Al Monitor for more on the stories impacting the Middle East. Until next time, I'm Adam Lucente.